Hello and welcome to The Hindu. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, the economics and business editor, and today I'm going to be in conversation with two eminent personalities. The first is Dr. Devesh Kapur. He's absolutely well-known political scientist. His work is read around the world. And the other is Dr. Arvind Subramanian. He is a former chief economic advisor to the government of India and also an eminent economist whose work again is read across the country. Now, we don't need any particular reason to talk to these two gentlemen, but today I do have one. They've written a book that will be released shortly. It's called A Sixth of Humanity, Independent India's Development Odyssey. It's an absolutely well-researched, deeply researched book. Not only does it have their insights, it has data, tables, graphics, all of this to back up their assertions. It takes us on a journey, as the name suggests, from our independence to now, going over how India has changed, and it also provides us some insight into the future. Thank you both so much for joining us. So Dr. Subramanian, I'll start with you, taking a cue from the title of your book, A Sixth of Humanity. Now, over the last 2 decades or more, we've been hearing about this demographic dividend that India is set to see or should be seeing right now. But now that we are a quarter of our way through the 21st century, at this juncture, do you feel that our population still has it in it to give us a dividend, or is it likely to become a demographic burden?
Yeah, a great question, Sharad, to begin. In a sense, the question is asking, during the period of the dividend, how overall did the economy perform, and what lessons can we take from it for the future? I think I would make two kind of broad points about what happened during this period of the demographic dividend. First, there's absolutely no doubt that, depending on when you date it, from about the 80s and then certainly the 90s, India experienced this dramatic dynamism, overall dynamism. Economic growth was very rapid, and per capita GDP growth from, say, 1980 to 2020, 25 is in the top 5 or 10 in the world. And it's about 4.5%. Compared to what we did before, it is just spectacular. And one of the points we make in the book is that, there's the old debate between Jagdish Bhagwati and Amartya Sen: is growth important, or, redistribution important? And what the experience shows is that, in a sense, they were both incomplete, because economic growth just changed everything in India, everything. Material well-being, social bonds, and the dissolving of hierarchies to some extent that Devesh has written very eloquently about. The resources available. In fact, it's during the period of this rapid growth that the Indian state became a caring, a social welfare state, as it were. So growth just changed everything about India. Of course, that growth was not evenly distributed, certainly across regions, and that created its own benefits, opportunities, and challenges. The uneven growth, one aspect of that, of course, is that it showed that some parts of India, the South and the West, actually could grow at Chinese rates of growth and for as long. But on the other hand, the uneven growth led to more migration, and has now, of course, led to all this kind of little bit disagreement about the sharing of fiscal resources. But point overall is that, just to use the literary, to invoke Naipaul here, Naipaul has a trilogy on India, right? Area of Darkness, Wounded Civilization, and A Million Mutinies. This period of growth exactly took us away from woundedness and diffidence to mutinous aspiration, and essentially fundamentally expectations changed in India, and the sense of possibility changed in India. So growth changed everything. But then we come to the second point, which relates even more directly to your question, that despite rapid economic growth, we did not achieve structural transformation. More specifically, we could not provide employment opportunities for the very young, for whom the demographic dividend was supposed to be the dividend, and on the basis of which we were supposed to grow. And I think that is, in some ways, the disappointment of the demographic dividend. And of course, going forward, there are lessons, but let me ask Devesh to come in.
Dr. Kapur?
So, Sharad, the demographic dividend is is about a potential. Really, it's because it really says that, look, the share of the working age population to the total population is high, and that is, you'll have far more people in the working age population who can work, which then leads to growth, etc., etc. But just because they are in that age cohort doesn't mean they're actually working. And even if they are working, are they working in the informal, low productivity sectors or in higher productivity formal sector? Now we know, and in the book we sort of point out to why uh, we see this period. It's been referred to as jobless growth. Basically, that the employment elasticity of growth has been low, and the various factors that might underlie that, and some of them are of course well known. Distortions in factor markets, whether labor, land, electricity, regulations, red tape, etc. I think two other things we point out, one which is also well known and one less so. You know, we know that education in India has increased rapidly since 1990, various government schemes, the demand for private education, etc. But it's also very clear that more and more young people have credentials, but learning outcomes have been poor and skills are still very weak. The second, and this I think is something new which we point out in the book, government labor markets have had a very severe distortionary role. The literally tens of millions of young people every year trying to get a government job. The probability that any one of them will get a job is about 1%. 99% will not. Who are spending some of the best years of their lives doing rote learning, trying to desperately get into any government job, right? Which means that they are not using their energies, their intellect for instance, in entrepreneurship, private initiative, etc., etc. And that distortionary effect is among the other factors that Arvind has alluded to, have meant that the dividend, the payoff, has not been as high as we had hoped for.
Just one, we may not come back to this topic again, but here's a kind of a new way of phrasing what Devesh said, right, about the importance of the government. See, I think that economists talk about Dutch disease, when one sector grows at the expense of the other sector, right? So in India, certainly in the last few years, the fact of the services sector growing has impacted the manufacturing sector. Exchange rates are very high, high skilled labor and talent is very high, and that affects the profitability of the manufacturing sector, which provides jobs. I think what we try and say in the book, that while that is a kind of well-known source of Dutch disease, what Devesh said, the government sector has been another kind of Dutch disease, and kind of in two ways. What Devesh said, but also that it has the government being so dominant in the labor market, and wages at the lower end of government labor, which competes with private manufacturing in terms of that is very high. And we have data showing how high government wages at the lower end are, which are the opportunity cost for a private sector to employ low skilled labor. That impact. So in a sense, the double Dutch disease of both services and the government sector have thwarted the demographic dividend in significant ways.
I see. And now, Dr. Kapoor, since you did mention the issue of education and skilling, the Economics Nobel Prize yesterday was, in essence, it was for research that talked about the importance of having a skilled workforce on the one hand, and also about having the optimal levels of R&D in an economy. So now, I mean, India has low levels of both. We have low levels of skilled workforce and low levels of private sector R&D. Is this a fixable problem for us?
Well, fixable in principle, but in practice, it's hard. I mean, on the R&D, when Arvind was CA, we worked together for the first time. The economic survey had a chapter on R&D. I think Arvind, was it the 2017 or 2018? Uh, the 2018. And, we showed that India is really an outlier in most countries, including China. The dominant R&D actor is the private sector. In India is the opposite. The dominant actor is the government sector, right? And where the R&D payoffs are pretty modest. I mean, if you look at the two largest groups that have grown so rapidly in India, Ambani and the Adani groups, and you just look at the number of international patents they have and compare them with, say, counterparts in Korea like Hyundai or Samsung. I mean, there's just no comparison, right? Because the rapidly growing businesses are in non tradable sectors like infrastructure, uh, and there are arguments that they have monopoly power. You collect rents, and therefore the incentives for R&D are much lower. In the case of the Korean chaebol, they had to compete in tradable products in international markets. And when you compete in international markets without innovation, you're just not going to go anywhere. And then at the lower end, on skilling and education, learning, as year after year, Pratham has been doing these surveys, and you see that we have done much better in having access to, say, primary or secondary education. That has really transformed. But the quality of education, and that is through right from the primary to our the median college or university. In fact, the learning crisis in universities might be even more severe, because one of the things we point out is India is a real outlier among countries in the world at the very high number of people enrolled in higher education relative to India's per capita income. So we are over investing in dubious higher education. It shows up in fancy numbers like high gross enrollment ratios. But that does not mean that those who graduate have the necessary skills for a rapidly changing labor.
Sharad, I'm glad you raised the Nobel Prize, because I have a little bit of a pet peeve about this, which I think people forget. See, I don't disagree about the need for innovation, etc., and skilling, etc. But I think we have to be cautious about this. Whenever there's a Nobel Prize, and we all kind of say, "Oh, what is it?" Culture, R&D, etc., etc. See, remember, this Nobel Prize applies much more to countries at the frontier. Frontier countries have to innovate, and grow faster. But countries well within the frontier, while innovation is not unimportant, I mean, we have a lot of catch up to do, even if we don't innovate, as long as we have the ability to kind of imbibe what's been done and convert it into practices on the ground that will allow us to catch up. I mean, for example, just to give you, coming back to your demographic dividend, we don't do a lot of apparel exports, and we should be doing, you know, 10 times more apparel exports in terms of this, right? Now, for the last 20 years, nothing about the technology, not doing, R&D, this was the binding constraint to that. It was just, all the things that Devesh alluded to that came in the way. But of course, now it's possible that with robots, even maybe the labor intensive sectors, we may need to use this technology and therefore get ahead. But it's just a slight caution that, when you're well within the frontier, the ability to use existing technology is much more important than the ability to necessarily generate new technology and so on. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two, which I think is related to what Devesh said, I think that the key insight from at least the Joel Moker work on the thing is that the country has to have a kind of willingness and an openness to a culture of ideas, technology, etc. Right? And what does that mean for India today? Do we have that similar culture of allowing dissent? Allowing people to do different things, having a critical mindset. The more we say all the lessons are in history and all the glory is in history, the less your mindset will be open to the kinds of things that Joel pointed out, that we need a kind of a culture of criticism, reasoning, openness. That, I think, has relevance for what we would call in Hindi the mahal today.
If I could just add one point there, I think Arvind has very nicely uh, pointed out some of these issues. But take something like the construction sector, right? Bridges. If you look at just the last few years, how many bridges have fallen down, right? The quality of civil engineering, right? Civil engineering is regarded as somehow an old sector, right? But when you're building all this infrastructure, if you compare the quality, and here we're talking of the quality of infrastructure being built in China versus India, there's no doubt that there is a big difference. S- Government infrastructure is often done by the PWD. I don't think so. The Hindu has ever done, or any newspaper, because we've looked a lot, a serious analysis of how the PWD's practices have changed in the last century. Forget the last 20 years. These are, no government wants to look at inside their main departments like the PWD. Are they up to standards? The technologies that are widely available internationally,
Exactly. Exactly.
right? You don't need R&D for civil engineering as much, meaning, you, of course, there are frontiers, but a lot of knowledge is around there.
So the challenge is much more boring and mundane, as it says, than fancy. We don't have the latest robots for everything, or that do not producing robot.
But now, towards the end of your book, you did have a section that dealt with corruption and how it's an endemic problem. And you ask about, you raise the question, why has it not been addressed yet? And now, is this because the powers that be, it's not in their interests to address it? Or is there something else? Is this a reality we have to live with? Dr. Subramanian, if you could take.
No, no. See, I want to come back to the economic dimension of this in a second, but Devesh has some important things we'll say on the election and the political side of it. So let Devesh go first. Devesh.
So, Sharad, look, uh, everyone, many of the things we point out, in that we discuss, from the police reforms to the endemic delays in courts, and we show these problems were highlighted in government reports in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, 2010s. Every decade, forget outside, internal government official reports have completely pointed this out, discussed endlessly in parliament. There is nothing new about the problem. It is what we call, it is strategic failures. In other words, it is, I want to keep the police weak. I want to keep the courts weak so that the political classes have more power to do what they want to do. And that is equally true of corruption. Now, to be fair, and I put the word fair in quotes, corruption, we simply do not want to confront the fact. We laud our that we are the world's biggest democracy. You cannot have democracy without elections. You cannot have elections without money. It's as simple as that. And we just haven't confronted the fact that now, as you know, you have elections, literally millions, because you have the 73rd and 74th Amendment, you have local level, state level, national level. Elections are very competitive, and without money, you cannot win. And that is not just unique to India. We are seeing how election financing has also distorted America's uh, politics. Uh, you know, you know, as I think uh, 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 Pranab Bardhan once had a great line in America. In India, the corruption occurs in the breaking of laws. In the US, it occurs in the making of laws, right? Which is the lobbyists, and how the law is to favor or disfavor some business interests. Not that that is absent in India, but so I mean, look, this is going to be with us. There are simply no magic bullets here. And but I think the larger thing is that the one unfortunate fact has become that the sole accountability mechanism we have basically now left with in the country is elections. All other accountability mechanisms have been severely weakened, and it's not even clear that the electorate cares. You had one election when AAP won on the anti corruption wave. If you and Mr. Modi came to power in 20,000 in 2014. But let's face it, today corruption is as endemic, no, in all states across the country, no matter what political party.
So, yeah. So can I just? I want to add a few small thoughts to what Devesh said. See, Sharad, look, corruption being. Oh, I think he's frozen again. Okay, so Sharad, the thing is that there is no period in the history of humanity where rapid growth has not been accompanied by corruption. Whether it's China in the last 25 years, or if you look back at the Gilded Age in the late 1800s, rapid growth, I mean, huge corruption. So I think one has to be a little bit careful that in some ways it is intrinsic to the beast of rapid growth that you're going to have corruption, and it's possible that actually corruption is in some ways the grease that requires rapid growth to occur, and we know that from the Chinese third tier example that there's truth to some of that. But I think one way of the way I would read what Devesh is saying is that, So all systems, especially during rapid growth, remember, so China had rapid growth, autocratic system, massive corruption. US in the 1800s had democracy with rapid corruption, the Gilded Age. So it is not so much, these things, that what you finally need are accountability mechanisms of some sort to kind of keep this in check, one, and prevent it from dampening private investment and the incentives for investment, small and medium enterprises, etc. So I think, therefore, at least one distinction one can make here is, again, the Mansur Olson thing, that if corruption is just a fixed cost of doing business, I think people are very happy, or not unhappy, they can live with it. But if corruption takes the form of creating risks and uncertainty, what the Mansur Olson distinction between the stationary bandit and the roving bandit, then of course the costs become very high. So in some ways, rule of law, the excessive discretion, those are maybe things we should think about in terms of how to manage corruption. I think it's pie in the sky that you think you can kind of eliminate or drastically reduce corruption, especially in a period of rapid economic growth.
I understand. And okay, so now, as kind of my final question to wrap up this discussion, because it's kind of impossible to touch on every aspect in your vast book. But basically, from my reading of things, India seems to be stuck in a kind of vicious cycle as opposed to a virtuous one. So, you have, as you've mentioned in the book, there are not enough high paying, high quality jobs, which means that people aren't being paid enough. And so that means that there's not enough demand in the economy, which then means that the private sector doesn't have enough incentives to invest to increase their capacity, which then further means that they are not going to create those jobs, and round we go. So, I mean, I'm going to ask this to both of you, but I mean, do you feel, I know that you've resisted in the book from giving your, top 5 reforms that India needs, but are there any lessons from history that can pull us out of this cycle? Dr. Subramanian, if you want to start.
So, okay, look, Sharad, as you rightly said, one of the things when you look over 75 years is that you get the humility that, real change occurs in India, has occurred in India, either in the aftermath of crises, economic, like in 66, or political, with Mrs. Gandhi and 77 and so on, or it has happened mostly, as we said earlier, just because of rapid growth. The unintended consequences of rapid growth in India are thing, and therefore to come up with the litany of list of reforms just seems like a kind of fool's errand. And also, even Devesh and I will not disagree on what the top 5 things are. So it's not very useful. So that's why what we end the book by saying is, look, simple Hippocratic oath with doctors are given: do no harm. And more specifically, what we say is that, instead of a to-do list, we need a simple list of things that we should not do, or maybe even undo. And for us, and I let Devesh elaborate much more, is that we did some amazing things over 75 years, right? And especially from in the beginning, democracy, sustaining it, whatever imperfect as it may be. And something that Devesh has written very eloquently about earlier also, having order, the security state was reasonably good. I mean, compared to other countries, we had much less disorder and violence and so on. And of course, we've built a state, and we've built a nation, which is so fragile. If you look across the world, so many countries, large countries, diverse countries. Remember, to build a nation under Indian conditions of all these cleavages, caste, religion, region, gender, is so difficult. We've achieved that. And and that's been the building block for everything else that we did, say, after 1980 and 1990. it is not those valuable, hard earned, fragile successes is what we should not squander now. And once you do that, allow the 1.4 billion entrepreneurial Indians to look after the rest.
Okay. And Dr. Kapoor?
Well, I just second everything that Arvind said. you know, uh, I think, look, my sense is, Sharad, that the way the world order was last 75 years is clearly changing. The international climate is going to be much tougher, and India's security climate will also be much tougher, given that for the first time there's a superpower next door. So, you know, there's that old saying, the thought of a hanging can concentrate the mind. And I think these risks, and I think the evidence is clear how India has been buffeted by these risks, whether the skirmishes India has had on its northern and western borders, uh, or, of course, as we now know, on international trade with the US. So I think unless you get your domestic act together, and in some ways you could argue that the negative international environment in some ways might be the very thing we need to give that push to. It's a wake up call, and that if you don't wake up and realize where the world is going, life is going to get tough. We had that in 66 when it was clear the neglect of agriculture, the high dependency on the US for wheat, what it led to, and it led to change. We had that in 1990 because essentially we were bankrupt in terms of foreign exchange reserves, and that led to a major change. So, one is that, these exogenous shocks in sort of economic speak uh, hopefully can be the impetus for uh, and you could argue that the recent GST reforms, which have been received quite positively, were in response to this growing international, uh, you know, uh, crisis or pressures internationally. I mean, uh, of course, but uh, I think, as Arvind said, where you sit every day. There are things of what reforms India should do. This is a well-known, well-trodden path. There is, as that's why we weren't going to write, oh, you should do this laundry list. Much of it, what we need to do is known. The question is, do you have the political will? And what is it that will take to generate that political will to act?
So just to add to what Devesh said, one last thing is that, see, one of the things, at least from my economic perspective, that one of the successes of India was a federal democracy. Always there are strains and stresses and so on, right? But broadly, cooperative federalism, right? What was called the amicable union when the constitution was created, is India's future unless the states and the center and the states amongst themselves cooperate. Virtually no big problem can be solved in India. That's why the last chapter we begin with this, the Delhi pollution problem. Even something like that requires the cooperation of 3, 4 states, the center and the states to come together, because Devesh says it very well, fires don't respect borders, right? The fire doesn't say, is this a BJP state or a, Congress state? It doesn't respect borders. And if you look across the board, whether it's the GST, whether it's power sector reform, whether it's agriculture, whether it's even health and education, there has to be cooperation between the center and the states going forward. So, what Devesh said, here's a crisis, right? Never waste a crisis. And but the way to build up resilience, not a list of reforms, but the basic framework of cooperation between the center and the states, that also is a very important component of the successes that we built up, which we should not squander.
Sharad, if I could just add one point there. I think, in addition, and as Arvind pointed out, that's going to be critical. Going forward, what is also going to be critical is giving, allowing the 74th Amendment to really work. One of the things we show in the book is the real centralization in India is at between tier 2 and tier 3. Most states in India are larger than most countries in the world, and the degree to which they have absolutely refused to allow cities and towns to have the autonomy to grow and compete with each other. Because remember, competition across states is good, right? Tamil Nadu is clearly doing so well in manufacturing. Other states are saying, wait a second, industries are going there, jobs are going there. What should we do? But that competitive dynamic, if you unleash it not across just the 28 states, but 30, but 300 of the largest cities in India, it really will be a much greater impetus. But that that degree of centralization, and basically the states have really thwarted the intentions of the 74th Amendment. That is something we point out is going to be, because India is going to urbanize much more.
Absolutely.
Yeah. In fact, Devesh's excellent point. The way to frame it is say we need not just cooperative federalism, but cooperative sub-federalism.
Right. But on that note, I mean, I could go on and on talking about this book. In fact, one of the standout chapters for me in the book was the one on nation building through fiscal federalism, especially where we are right now in the center-state relations. That chapter really stood out. But on that note, thank you so much for joining us. This was a fascinating conversation, and congratulations on your book.
Thanks so much.
Yes. Thanks.